evening. Good evening and welcome. I'm Karen Mezan, the president of Tam High PTSA. The Tam High PTSA is, as are all PTSAs, a child and family advocacy group, first and foremost. Before I forget, can everybody please take this opportunity to silence your phone? Thank you so much. So we as the PTSAs and parents group bring you events like tonight to help you during this occasional or perhaps frequent turbulent times of raising adolescents. You are here tonight because of a collaboration of 9 schools in Marin County. Your school's PTSA or parent group has provided financial resources so that together we can have access to amazing thought leaders like Dr. Sachs. I would like to thank all the schools who are involved in tonight's programs. Tam High School, Redwood, Drake, Branson High School, as well as the following middle schools: White Hill, Kentfield, Mill Valley, Hall, and finally the Reed Unified School District. Parent ed collaborations like this are invaluable, so please support your PTSA or parent fund. With that, I am especially honored tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Brad Sachs. Dr. Sachs is a psychologist, educator, consultant, and best-selling author specializing in clinical work with children, adolescents, couples, and families in Columbia, Maryland. He is the founder and director of the Father Center, a program designed to meet the needs of new and expectant and experienced fathers. He's written numerous books for the general and professional audiences, including award-winning The Good Enough Teen, Raising Adolescents with Love and Acceptance, Despite How Impossible They Can Be, and When No One Understands, Letters to a Teenager on Life, Loss, and the Hard Road to Adulthood. Dr. Sachs has been interviewed on hundreds of radio and television shows, including the Today Show, 2020, and the Diane Rem Show. He's a graduate of Brown University, where he met his wife, Dr. Karen Meckler, and together they have raised 3 adult children in a sequence of rescue mutts. They are currently preparing to welcome their 2nd granddaughter into their lives and are planning to indulge her as conscientiously as they have done with their first. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brad Sachs.
Thanks for having me. I hope my voice is hearable, but pretty much everything I say is going to be projected up on slides on this screen, and all the PTSAs will have access to the PowerPoint slides when I'm done, so you don't have to take notes or any of that stuff. So I want to talk about this topic, the good enough child, how to have an imperfect family be perfectly satisfied, the experience of what is enough, what is good enough. Must we torment ourselves constantly in terms of what kind of children we're raising and what kind of parents we are? And I'd like to take you on a little bit of a voyage. Oh, thanks for telling me. Now? Dave? Now? Now. So, there's 2 theoreticians that I want to cite to begin this, which will give us a little bit of a framework. First one is Anna Freud. This is the daughter of Sigmund Freud. And she had a very lovely depiction of parenthood, which I think we want to keep in mind, particularly when we're raising adolescents. And her advice is remembering that your job is to be there to be left. Your job essentially is to be abandoned. And the question is, how do we prepare our children to abandon us? What's the best way to do it? The second theoretician I want to cite is Jerry Seinfeld. And in an interview I was listening to with him, they said, you know, he makes a living talking. They said, what were the first words that you remember saying? You know, what were the first words that you remember verbalizing? And he said it was, leave me alone. And this is really the essence of child development is, you know, how do we nurture them? How do we care for them? But how do we also leave them alone and get out of the way enough that they can take care of business and do their job of becoming the person that they're destined to become? So a couple of cartoons kind of capture the ambivalence we have about what we expect children to be doing. This is a mom saying, I have to take him to his class for things kids used to learn on their own. This is a kindergarten teacher saying, we've created a safe, non-judgmental environment that will leave your child ill-prepared for real life. These are parents carrying their college graduate son. Sometimes I think we want this more than he does. There's mom in the background. And then we wind up with that situation. So why are these cartoons funny? Why do we laugh at them? First thing about humor, remember, humor is essentially about things that are not funny. That's what human beings do very well. We figure out how to laugh at things that are not funny. We laugh at this because we're highly conflicted about the role that parents should play in children's lives. And sometimes there's a sense of a pendulum swinging so that we're basically suffocating, saturating, and gorging our children with parenthood. And then we wind up in situations like that where we wind up leeching them or bleeding them of autonomy, of initiative, of self-sufficiency. And so there's no magic algorithm that tells you exactly how much parenting to do or not do, but that's what I want to focus on today, which is looking inside, looking at your child, and finding some balance that promotes growth and development. And while these cartoons are very modern, you know, this theme is an ancient theme too. I'm going to show you two pictures Leonardo da Vinci did. You see Madonna and child here. If you look at that child, the child is nursing, but the child is not looking at the mom. The mom is gazing at the child. The child is looking somewhere else. The child's looking outwards. And so Da Vinci, in a way, captures, even in the earliest stages of life, there's that desire to leave home, to become part of the world. And if you look at this picture, too, you see the Madonna's showing the child something. And my perspective on this is the baby, she's showing the baby this twig, and he's saying, let me figure this twig out myself. He's kind of looking at it, but he's also shoving her hand away. So we laughed at these cartoons, all of which are fairly contemporary, but the theme of what role do parents play? What is their job? What is our job? How do we promote that autonomy, that self-regard, that self-assuredness? This is an ancient dilemma. And it's going to be an eternal dilemma as far as I can tell, and that's what we're going to talk about this evening. So let's talk about how to have an imperfect family and be perfectly satisfied. And as I said, first rule is we're all flying by the seat of our pants. Not every child-rearing dilemma has an answer. Not every question has a solution. And really the only predictable and explicable aspect of raising children is just how unpredictable and inexplicable they are. We have yet to figure this out. So I was like this, yes, I fly by the seat of my pants, but I have great pants. You're all flying by the seat of your pants. I was flying by the seat of my pants and still am to some extent, but most of us have decent pants, and so you want to kind of go with that flying by the seat of the pants business. Second is what you see is what you're likely to get. The child's self-image, the child's self-regard is a mirror of how we look at them, the lens that we look at them through. And if all we see when we look at them is disappointment, disillusionment, not measuring up, not reaching your potential, that becomes the basis for their self-regard. They never feel like they're good enough. If what they see is us appreciating them for who they are rather than who we wish they could be, then there's the basis for self-regard, self-assuredness, and a sense of self-worth that's going to carry you through life. Everything you feel from this point forward is normal. We have basically sanitized and tried to domesticize parenthood, and we assume it has to be this tranquil, serene, pleasant, delightful, prideful experience. But it's just not the nature of human relatedness that any intimate relationship is that calm and is that smooth. we have to learn to tolerate the entire spectrum of feelings. It is natural, it is normal at times to be disgusted with your children, to hate them, to regret having had children, to wonder why you did that. And when we try to hive off, when we try to narrow or restrict the definition of what's acceptable parenting emotions, we actually make it harder for our children because they start to restrict their own emotional life as well. Children need us the most when they are the least pleasant to be with. This is one of the painful realities of parenthood. It's easy to love your child and take delight in them when they're, making the honor roll and taking tests and doing well and captaining the lacrosse team. But those aren't the times when they really need us. They need us the most when they're their most difficult, they're most unpleasant, they're most disappointing, or they're most disillusioning. Of course, those are the times when we want nothing to do with them. We just want to focus on another child that we have, or maybe our niece or nephew who's cooler than our child. But this is the time when they really need us to summon our sense of compassion, our sense of empathy, our connection with them when they're not necessarily following the path that we've laid out for them. As long as you do somewhat more positive parenting than negative parenting, things are likely to turn out fine. The sense that we have to be perpetually patient, tolerant, compassionate, accepting, is realistic. And we have the sense that, parenting is this tightrope walk, and if we just make one misstep, catastrophe is going to ensue, and our children will plummet to their psychological demise. And it's just not how it works. Children are very hardy, they're very supple, they're very resilient. We somehow survived our parents survived their parents. We're a hardy species. We came to the top of the food chain for a lot of reasons. So children are not quite as brittle or as fretful or as vulnerable or fragile as we often describe them or depict them. Nothing important comes easy. Pain, discomfort, and disruption are necessary counterparts to growth. All parents want to protect their children from pain, from discomfort, from suffering. But the reality is it's only when we encounter pain, it's only when we experience adversity that we grow. It's when the world disappoints us. It's when the world disillusions us. It's when our expectations don't match the world's expectations. That's when we grow. It's that friction, it's that tension, it's that incongruity that really promotes our development as human beings, that deepens our soul and ennobles us. So while we don't want to leave our children overly vulnerable to pain and discomfort, we also don't want to get in the way of it too much because that's something that tends to grow us up. And again, if you look at artists, whenever I go to museums, I'm always looking at artwork. Many great painters, when they're painting adolescents and young adults, they capture that ennui, that confusion, that bewilderment. This is a picture by Modigliani. And, look at the expression on her face. You can see that uncertainty. This is Degas' self-portrait as a young man. These are not cheery, chipper, hyperactive-looking pictures. These are portraits of individuals who are really struggling with something. This is Cézanne's young Italian woman at table. Artists of any sort, graphic artists, visual artists, musical artists, literary artists, they have a way of capturing the elements, the fundaments, the essence of human experience in a way that other people don't. And so we want to pay close attention. When artists depict a young woman looking like that, it tells you that there's a lot on people's mind. And that's what we don't want to lose sight of in our efforts to help our children get to the right college, in our efforts to help our children learn good manners. We don't want to lose sight of the actual experience of what it means to be a human being. Childhood should be a preparation for adulthood, not a performance for adults. And this goes to what I was just saying, which is, children are constantly on a stage. They're constantly performing for us. They're constantly having to do something that is a referendum on what a good parent we are, how terrific we are. Look what our son is doing on the lacrosse field, on the stage, in the classroom, at the birthday party. But it's not their job to perform for us. It's their job to prepare for adulthood. And many times, part of preparing for adulthood is deviating and departing exactly from what our parents expect of us, unplugging and disinvesting from what mom and dad take pride in. At a certain point in development, and adolescence is usually that point, they don't want feathers in our cap. They want feathers in their own cap. And sometimes the feathers that they select and they put in their cap don't make us very happy, might not make us proud, but at least it's their cap. You know, what I have learned clinically over the years is most kids would rather be failures and be themselves than be successful and living someone else's life. And I would say that that's true of adults as well. If you're a success but you're living somebody else's life, it doesn't feel like success. It's an empty, it's a hollow experience. But even if you're failing, if you feel like you're inhabiting your soul, you're taking up residence in your own being, that's a sense of being human. That's a sense of fullness and wholeness. The person of the parent is more important than the person as a parent. We can lecture them and sermonize them and instruct them all we want, but they're watching us all the time. They're scanning us from the moment they're born. And it's our presence as an individual, what we do or what we don't do, that they're really learning the most from. So a lot of times parents are so busy focusing on being parents, they lose sight of themselves as people. And it's the people part, the person part, that the child is really learning from, really taking a good look at, and trying to absorb or assimilate. The parent's nurture must conform to the child's nature. We all have a way that we would like to nurture our child, and it has something to do with how we were raised and our own personality. You know, if we tend to be someone who's extroverted and outgoing, then it's easy for us to want to nurture in that way. But the problem is sometimes our child might have a different temperament than we have, or different interests. Our job as parents is to mold and accommodate and align ourselves with the nature of the child. And when we make that engagement happen, when we make those adjustments, when we don't rigidly insist that they adhere to the axioms that we believe create a good life or a successful life, that gives children the flexibility, the malleability, the suppleness to move on with their lives and become who they're destined to become. And we must convey that it's not what you have and what you do, but who you are that really makes a difference. It's who you are, it's how you love, it's how you give and receive love that ultimately creates a successful life. And as we'll see as we go through this presentation, the emphasis on achievement, on accomplishment, all these things often take us away from the very experience of giving and receiving love that ultimately enriches us, that ultimately gives life meaning. So we have a sense of a general framework, how to give yourself a little more room to maneuver. When I talk about the good enough child, the image that I have is that every child that we have really has had 3 births, not just 1 birth. This is the case whether the child comes to us by birth, by adoption, by step-parenthood, foster care, however this kid winds up in our child-rearing home. There's 3 births. The first is the birth of the fantasy child. And we have a fantasy child in mind before we even become parents. You know, even when we're children, we're envisioning what it will be like to parent. When you watch little children stroking a stuffed animal or playing with dolls, they're practicing parenting because it's built into our neurology to nurture, to care for. And so we all have this fantasy child in mind, and when we become parents and start a family, that child is going to be the child of our dreams. It's going to reinforce us and make us feel wonderful about ourselves, and we'll just look delightful because of this emissary that we have sent into the world. The problem is the child we get is a flesh and blood child, not a fantasy child. And the flesh and blood child, by definition, is going to disappoint, disillusion, and enrage you at various stages in the developmental spectrum. Sometimes this happens in utero. The baby's not growing well enough, and so, what's wrong with this kid? Sometimes it's at birth. You were wanting a girl and you got a boy, or you wanted a boy and you got a girl. It can happen during infancy. The baby's not nursing well. It happen during toddlerhood. Your kid doesn't play well with others. He's kicking the other kids in the preschool. When school starts, there's numerous ways for children to disappoint and disillusion us. They're not interested in school. They don't like to read. They don't want to hang out with anyone. No one invites them to parties. If by some magical happenstance your child has not disappointed or disillusioned you prior to adolescence, I can guarantee you that they will find a way to disappoint and disillusion you during that stage. They will pierce body parts that you didn't think should be pierced, and date people that you don't think they should be dating. So it's their job to disappoint and disillusion us. That's how they become their own person. So we as parents are stuck. We have this, sort of fantasy child, and then we have this flesh and blood child. And as soon as the flesh and blood child is alive, the fantasy child dies, basically. And the actual child is dancing on the grave of the fantasy child. Yes, I'm here. What we want to do is obviously integrate the two of them and come up with a good enough child. And good enough child is the child that we love, that we adore, that we take care of simply for being who he or she is, not who we want him or her to be. And this is the great challenge, and it's an ongoing process. And I'll be talking about how to move through that process, but believe me, it's not a linear process, and there's plenty of deviations on this serpentine journey to getting to good enoughness. But it's not such a bad thing if you can get there. So there's 5 stages that I'll kind of walk you through this evening. One is uncovering, one is acknowledging, one is understanding, one is forgiving, and one is growing and changing. And I'll get to those in a moment because it gives you a little bit of a roadmap, a little bit of a blueprint for how to move through this. But I also want to talk about, particularly when we're dealing with adolescents, some of the key elemental themes that I think we sometimes neglect when it comes to adolescent development. And as parents at this stage, we really want to pay close attention to. And perhaps the most important one, and the one that's most neglected, is that adolescence, despite all of the energy and excitement and developing and blossoming that's taking place, is ultimately a stage of grief. Charlie Brown here saying good grief, and grief can be a good thing. We think about grieving a lot when we think about someone dear to us who has departed, who has passed. But we also grieve when we move forward with our lives. From my perspective, every child needs to say goodbye to childhood in order to prepare for adulthood. The essence of growth, the essence of development is to say goodbye to one stage as you're preparing for the next stage. Many of the adolescents I work with, they say, I'm such a loser. And they're saying it in the sense of I'm losing at the game of life. I don't have a girlfriend, or I didn't get into the college I wanted, or, no one talks to me at lunchtime. But when they say I'm a loser, they're also saying it in this context of grief. I'm losing something essential. I'm losing some part of my identity. My childhood has to die for me to become an adult. And so when I'm working with suicidal adolescents, and I work a lot with suicidal adolescents, the pain that they're experiencing, the pain that makes them want to end their lives is they can't come to terms with the grief. They don't understand why they're mourning. And everyone is saying, oh, this is the best time of your life, and you should be doing this, you should be doing that. But as I said, there's an essential grief-stricken quality to adolescence that we want to pay attention to. A lot of adolescents get into the sort of goth or the emo stage. What color are they wearing when they're in the goth and emo stage? They're wearing black. What is black the color of? Black is the color of mourning. So they're not conscious of it. They're not aware of it. But we as parents, as teachers, as caregivers, we want to be aware that this is a very complicated stage. It's kind of one loss after another. The way I envision it is the tomb becomes the womb. You have to bury some part of yourself. You have to let go of some part of yourself to move on to the next stage of life. It's kind of like an immigrant. An immigrant has to leave certain things behind to reconstitute him or herself on the shore of the new country. You can't bring everything with you. And that's one of the essentially melancholy, bittersweet parts of adolescence that we often neglect. And there's all kinds of grieving. The child has to grieve for the past, and there's all these things. She has to forgive her parents for their limitations. She has to recognize the irreversible nature of growth, that time only moves in one direction. She has to acknowledge that she's unique but still ordinary, come to terms with the reality of aloneness. You enter the world alone, you depart the world alone, relinquish in fantasies of invulnerability, immortality. There's a tremendous matrix of losses associated with growth. When we support adolescents in saying goodbye to those parts of their life, they tend to more naturally and more successfully move forward. But we don't speak the language of grief in this culture. We're so busy focusing on accomplishment, achievement, competition, academic supressity, virtuosity, who's the best, which college, SATs, ACTs, AP, all the stuff. And we miss the essential nature, the essential language of grief that every adolescent is struggling with, whether he or she knows it or not. And so we often leave them in this position where a young one's saying, diving for it would look good on my college application. Everything becomes part of an appearance. This sense of loneliness, this sense of introspection, this sense of loss that's associated with this crucial stage of life. And like I said, it's happening in every stage, but adolescence, it really heats up, is really essential. Who is last year's Nobel laureate? Nobel laureate for literature was Bob Dylan. And, you know, the song I remember, I used to sit in my bedroom when I was a teenager listening to Like a Rolling Stone over and over again. What is the essence of that song? By the way, this meant I had to get up, pick up the needle, and put it back on that track. And let's do it, and then do it again. None of this clicking business that everyone can do now. What does he ask? Why is he the Nobel laureate? How does it feel? How does it feel to be on your own? This is the essential dilemma of adolescent life. And when we overly focus on grades, on achievements, on accomplishments, we miss that drama, and we miss that essence of growth that's absolutely essential. And by the way, it's not just the adolescent who's grieving. The parent is grieving too, because parents of adolescents begin to see the end in sight. You're never more necessary. You're never more relevant. You're never more essential than when you're raising a child. And adolescents are telling you, hey, buddy, you're about to be replaced, and I don't need you quite as much as you think I'm needed. So this picture by Van Gogh, Memory of the Garden at Eton, really seems to capture that for me. You see the two older people are leaving the garden, and there's the younger person gardening. You know, this is human development right here. The bittersweet, melancholy experience that as you move forward, you have to say goodbye to the garden because it's someone else's turn to tend the garden. This cartoon kind of captures it too. It's like we're motoring along through midlife, feeling pretty decent about ourselves, but there's this little sense of mortality that's pricking at us. That prick, that's your adolescent son or daughter. They're saying, hey, listen, I'm shoving you into the twilight of significance, so get ready to be on the side stage, not center stage. And of course, as parents, we have very mixed feelings about this. There's the parent fish saying, go, evolve, don't worry about me. And you can see the grief-stricken adolescent fish who's trying to make his or her own way. I don't know who you are anymore. You know, this is what we say to our children. How dare you evolve? How dare you leave this comfortable ocean of family? Why don't you just stay and work on being a better fish? Why do we laugh? We laugh because it's tragic that we're spending all this time raising our children and investing, compromising, sacrificing. We're doing all these things, and they're just going to leave us behind. And adolescents know that, and they won't hesitate to exploit it to their advantage. So you want to be aware of that too. So this issue is they have to grow, they have to develop, they have to move away, and yet they still need us. They still need that connection with us. They need to know that we're still supportive of them. It's a sense of they have to discover an I while still maintaining a we. And that's that amphibious quality that makes us crazy when we're working with adolescents. You know, it's like they're like a trapeze. They're going to wanting to be with us to not wanting to be with us because they're trying to figure out how do I be an I, and yet I don't want to lose that we-ness. I'm not so crazy about being on my own. How does it feel? How does it feel? It doesn't always feel so good to be on your own. Freedom for an adolescent, you know, it's delicious. You know, they thirst for it. They hunger for it. But it's dangerous too. With freedom comes responsibility. With freedom comes loss. So there's that sense of they want to be apart, in the sense of apart from us, but they still want to be a part of us. And, you know, one of the great myths in our culture is, you know, the Wizard of Oz. Why does the Wizard of Oz speak to every generation? Why does everybody love the Wizard of Oz? Well, this is the story of adolescent development. You know, Dorothy is, you know, whisked from Kansas to this intoxicating, exhilarating, remarkable inescapable world of Oz. And, you know, she loves what's happening and who she's meeting, and she's learning so much. But what is the backdrop narrative? What is the mantra that's at the bottom of The Wizard of Oz? What does she keep saying? There's no place like home. And so everybody at this stage is kind of like Dorothy. They're in Oz. They feel like they should be in Oz, and yet there's a part of them that just wants to be at home in bed in Kansas. I don't know if you guys see Zitz. Says here he's running away. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. That's the first frame. Second frame is how'd the SAT practice go? Adolescents, they want to escape. They just want to get away from all this stuff. The pressure is just killing them and wearing them. All they want to do is just bury themselves in their couch. And we, as a community, as a society, as parents, we have some say in that navigation between Oz and home. Related to that, children have to say no to us. They have to create tension. They have to create friction. They have to rattle the cage for their more independence, because that's how they become their own person. I always say that adolescents defy us in order to define themselves. There has to be some bumping up against. There has to be some conflict. Families that don't have that conflict are not doing their job. A lot of times when families come to me for treatment, parents are concerned about one child, the child that they're fighting with the most, but another child or two, they're doing fine, you know, they do what we want them to do. Those are the kids that I'm often more worried about, because they're not engaging in some of the battles. They're not engaging in some of the wars that are an essential part of human development. I don't know if you read this story to your children, Where the Wild Things Are, but that's what it's about. It's about a child defying his parents and going to another world to try to figure out who he is. And so many of the myths, the stories that speak to these generations, they work for us because parents aren't in the picture. Think about Harry Potter. Are Harry Potter's mom and dad helping him, you know, work through all this stuff? No, they're nowhere to be found. So this image, this myth, this narrative of moving out into the world on your own, that's where the adolescent drama hinges. That's where growth really takes place. And we, as parents, have to figure out a way to find some margin, some area, some province or region where we're still there for them, but giving them the room to move ahead and to grow. So like I said, the parent-child battles, they're not only essential for growth, it's a way to acknowledge each other, how important we are to each other. And in general, my experience has been that the worst fights in family, the most damaging fights, usually are resulting because the family's trying to avoid fights. They're so afraid of tension. They're so afraid of conflict. They're so afraid of ruffled feathers, of going toe-to-toe with each other, that they just don't have any of that friction or that contact going that really promotes growth. Related to fighting, teens and children in general often prefer to fight with others than with themselves. The way I see it is sort of like what I call psychodialysis. You know what a regular kidney dialysis machine does? It, you know, if your kidney's not working, you get hooked up to the machine, and the machine purifies and cleanses your blood and then sends it back to you in a sanitized form. Sometimes I think that's what we need to do for adolescents, is just they have all these toxic, crazy, turbulent, unruly emotions and feelings, and they spew it all out on us. And our choices are either to react and become just as unruly in response to them, or kind of take a moment to just process and realize that a lot of times they're just outsourcing their distress. They're just making it, it's impossible for them to manage their discomfort, their interior conflicts and dilemmas. And so what do? They spew it out, they outsource it to us, and we then have to metabolize it for them. So I said there were 5 stages. Then I just gave you some backdrop to what's happening, particularly during adolescence. The uncovering stage has to do with paying attention to your expectations, because it's really hard to find that middle ground with expectations of our children. When the expectations are too high, the child always feels demoralized because they never feel like they're measuring up. Expectations are too low, and you're not encouraging a child to capitalize on his or her strengths. So we want to find that middle ground. And the way we do that is to pay attention to the expectations that we have. Sometimes they're very conscious. I gave you some examples here. They better do what we wished we had done. They better do what our parents made us do. They better not make the mistakes we made. They better make the same good choices that we make. So sometimes we have these conscious expectations, but sometimes we have these unconscious expectations as well. We expect our children to heal our relationship with our parents. Our parents were never proud of us, and now we're going to present the perfect grandchild to our parents, and that will finally elicit the blessing that we've been looking for from our parents. We expect the child to replace a lost or a loved one. We want them to erase our flaws or failures. They have to reflect well on us. They have to heal our marriage. And it's these unconscious expectations that really become most problematic for kids. It's impossible to have a child without having some expectations for them. Because after all, we're making all these sacrifices and compromises and investments in the service of their growth. You know, we want them to pay us back in some sort of currency, in some sort of coin that's meaningful. But the problem is then they wind up in what I call the Alcatraz of unachievable expectations. I figured since I was in the Bay Area, I would use a local reference. So, you know, we incarcerate our children. We imprison them with these unreasonable expectations, and it wears them down. And when we're more conscious of the expectations, more aware of what we expect of our children, both on the surface and under the surface, then it's better. Then it's a little bit easier for us to modulate them and tailor them and help us see if these are really relevant to our child. So here's a little girl saying to her mom, "I am not your do-over." And that's often what we expect. We want them to make good on the promises that we didn't make good on to ourselves. We want them to be the best version of us. You know, me 2.0. That's who I want my son or daughter to be. And they're not interested in that. And they don't want to do that. And every time we lay that on them without being aware of it, it makes them a little less happy and a little bit less pleasant to be with. This shows up a lot because, you know, we've so narrowed the definition of what normal development is. We've so restricted the definition of what a healthy child is that the slightest deviation, the slightest departure now is seen as some sort of emotional disturbance or mental illness. And, you know, we spend a lot of time naming problems, but we don't look at the climate in which these problems occur. So, you know, many times parents bring a child to me, and I think my son is depressed. Well, why do you think he's depressed? You know, he's not sleeping well, and he's mopey, and he's irritable. And I would say 80% of the kids who are brought to me for depression treatment are not depressed at all, but they're oppressed. They're oppressed by these unreasonable expectations. They're oppressed by the belief that they have to be someone other than who they are at their core to engender their parents' approval or blessing. This general sense of children and teens being oppressed, that's what wears them down. It can't possibly be that 20 to 30% of children actually have attentional deficiencies or actually have bipolar disorder. It makes no sense. You know, like I said, after all these years of evolution, we all can't have faulty brains, but we're looking at them through the wrong lens. And when we look at them through the wrong lens, we start to treat them like something's wrong with them. And that's the worst thing for a teenager to feel, like there's something wrong with them. Acknowledging is paying attention to some of the ways that we react when our children do disappoint and disillusion us, when they start to show us that they're not going to do exactly what we want them to do. And we all have these kind of reactions, these almost instinctive, reflexive responses when our teens disappoint or disillusion us, which tend to be unhelpful for the most part. So, I mean, let's say you have a middle school student who just doesn't like to read. And you're worried about that because, you know, reading is essential and literacy and standardized testing is coming up in college, and your kid just doesn't like to read. So we kind of lock into or pivot into these modes, which we don't even know that we're doing half the time, but we still do it. So one of them might be hyper-parenting. We basically bludgeon our child with books and Kindles and literary things, and we go to the library, we bring books back, and we go to Barnes & Noble, and, you know, we basically asphyxiate them and gorge them with reading and reading materials because somehow we're going to get them to read. Or we get hypercritical. All we can focus on is the fact that they don't like to read, the fact that they are kind to animals, or that they write letters to their grandparents, or that they're a good friend. That's irrelevant because all we can focus on is that black dot on the paper. You're not reading as much as you should be reading. And by the way, your cousin reads all the time. You know, She's delightful. Can't take the book out of her hand. Sometimes we get over anxious and we start to extrapolate. We start to catastrophize. If you're not reading now, you're not going to do well in high school. Then you're not going to do well on standardized tests. Then you won't get into a good college, and you'll be working at the Gap. That's really the ceiling. You got to get this reading thing going. And we come up with these melodramatic scenarios which have no basis in reality. They're completely irrational, but of course we believe them because we know best, after all. Sometimes we blame ourselves. If I read more, maybe my son would read more. Or if I hadn't had that glass of wine during the 3rd trimester and blown out the bank of reading neurons that Shirley was developing, then he'd be reading. We blame others. That's why spouses come in handy. If you weren't watching ESPN all the time and were reading a book, our son would be reading more, but all you do is watch sports. Blame the school. They don't teach reading well. Bad 2nd grade teacher turned your kid off to reading. Everything would have been different if you had a different teacher. Sometimes we blame the child. What's wrong with you? How could you be like this? We kind of guilt trip them into reading. And then sometimes we just do the sort of angry withdrawal thing, which is screw you, play your video games, don't read. I'm going to focus the next 12 years on your little sister. She apparently likes to read. You can go work at the Gap and, send me a note or two. So if you don't recognize yourself in one of these categories, you're not close enough with your teen because, like I said, this is the sign of attachment when we act irrational, when we act crazy. And similar to expectations, it's just a matter of being aware of it. Why do we pivot into, why do we reflexively work into these maladaptive positions? Because it's probably what our parents did with us when we disappointed or disillusioned them. Or maybe it's the opposite of what our parents did with us. Who knows why we do it? But just being aware of it sometimes is enough to soften, to thaw out the rigidity of this response, and it gives both us and our teen a little bit more maneuverability. Stage 3 is understanding, and the key here is understanding that everything that we define as a child's problem is really their effort to solve a problem. Children are problem solvers. Human beings are problem solvers. We don't always like the way they're trying to solve the problem, but every child, when they're demonstrating something problematic, is really trying to solve a problem. And the problem is their mode of solving the problem is kind of creating more problems than it's solving. And when I'm listening to teens, when I'm listening to kids come into my office, no teenager ever comes into my office saying these things, but I'm listening for what problem they're trying to solve that would explain why they're doing something that's working to their disadvantage. And so if I had to put words to it in a crystallized sentence, it would be things like this. It's important for me to be seen as helpless, so not too much is expected of me. I can't stop acting angry, or everybody will think I've forgotten all the terrible things that have happened to me. I cannot do exactly what is being asked of me because I won't feel or appear like I'm my own person. I will no longer recognize myself if I give up this part of myself, no matter how much it works to my disadvantage. If I can't solve a problem on my own, it doesn't count, so there's no point in solving it. I'll feel humiliated if I decide to change and all the adults think I finally come around and tell me I told you so. If I become too successful, my parents will think that they're no longer necessary. I'm still too angry at my parents to make them proud of me and give them a chance to brag. If I made a change for the better, I'd have to beat myself up for not having made that change sooner than I did. I could put 100 of these slides up because every kid that I'm seeing, if they could articulate it, if they could crystallize their thinking, would explain to their parents or to me or to someone, I'm trying to solve a problem here. But the problem is we wind up in this sort of blaming mode. You say, okay, I admit it, we're lost, but the important thing is to remain focused on whose fault it is. Parents are blaming each other, the kids are blaming the parents, the school's blaming the parents, the school's blaming, the teacher's blaming the administrator, everyone's blaming, everyone's pointing fingers. The problem is we're not looking at problems as attempts to solve problems. And so when a problem is not being solved well, it doesn't mean it's a failure of the child or a failure of the parent or the school. It means it's a failure of our imagination. We haven't figured out what problem they're trying to solve. Once we take this attitude, once we adopt this approach, we're automatically on the same side of the fence as our adolescent. We're no longer adversaries. We're no longer enemies. Why are you doing this is no longer the question. The question is, can we figure out a better way for you to solve this problem? And then the whole energy, the whole dynamic, the whole connectedness between the parent and the teen begins to shift when we realize that everything that vexes us about them is really their sometimes misguided attempt to become their own person, to achieve autonomy, to find purpose and to find meaning. And that takes us to forgiveness. We usually think about forgiveness in the sense of, someone's hurt us or someone injured us. But to go back to what I started with, forgiveness is necessary when someone disappoints us or disillusions us. And when I talk about forgiveness, sorry about that. I'm not talking about giving in to your child or tolerating things that you shouldn't tolerate. Wait, I'm having a little, there we go. Being afraid of being disliked or unpopular, allowing yourself to be disappointed. But basically it means liberating your children from the expectation that they'll make all of our parental dreams come true. We're going to forgive them for not being the fantasy child, for being an actual flesh and blood child who is not exactly who we wanted them to be, but still deserves to be loved and cared for. And when we forgive our children, when we forgive our teens, we liberate ourselves as well. Forgiveness, as we know, is the gift to ourselves, ultimately. It's not a gift to someone else. And we as parents deserve to emancipate ourselves from the unreasonable expectations that we place on ourselves, because sometimes we're pretty unreasonable with ourselves. All of us leading to stage 5, and this is about growth and change. And if you kind of stumble your way through the first 4 stages, you'll find that change and growth really develop kind of naturally, because children have within them an internal engine. We don't have to motivate children. I get very tired. I grow so weary. How do I motivate my son to do his Spanish homework? How do I motivate my daughter to focus more on lacrosse? She could be so good. You can't motivate anybody. No one can be motivated. Motivation's an inside job. It takes place inside. You can change the external conditions that might raise the possibility that someone will motivate themselves, but you can't motivate anybody else. I know a lot of people make their living as motivational speakers, and they might not like to hear that, but that's not how it works. It's an interior engine that every single kid has. So if they're not motivated in the way that we think they should be, then we got to look at the climate, the ecology within which they don't seem to be summoning, finding, discovering, marshaling their internal motivation. And the key to this is that true growth only occurs in a loving relationship. We are creatures of love. We are here designed, built to give and receive love. The parent-child relationship is a love relationship. The teacher-student relationship is a love relationship. The therapist-patient relationship, these are love relationships. Our job as parents, as adults, mentors, teachers, whatever we're doing with teens, it's to help them fall back in love with themselves. That's when they start to go astray, is when they lose interest in themselves, when they lose affection for themselves, when they don't feel like they're very comfortable in their own skin. We want them to fall in love with themselves a little bit, not to become narcissistic, arrogant jerks, but to simply appreciate themselves for who they are, which has everything to do with how much we appreciate them for who they are. So this is, one of the key paradoxes of parenthood that I still struggle with and that everybody struggles with. But the reality is children are most likely to change for the better if they know that they're going to be loved and accepted for staying the same. And we don't want to do that. We don't want them to stay the same. We think they should be doing better in history. We think if they took the SATs for the 4th time, that score would go up. And this sense of potential, it makes all of us miserable. It's a peculiarly modern concept that there's us and then there's the potential us. And I sure wish we would relieve ourselves of the belief that our child has a potential self. How many times do you hear that or say that? You have the potential to be the best violinist in the orchestra, but you're not practicing enough. Or why won't she capitalize on her potential? It's a meaningless concept. We are who we are. And constantly feeling like we're suffering in comparison with our idealized self as described by our parents or our teachers or our coaches makes us terribly unhappy. Doesn't make for a very satisfying life, because then no matter what we accomplish, it's never enough. It's never good enough because I'm not capitalizing completely on my potential. So we have to accept children as they are for them to then naturally grow and develop and find their motivation and develop ambition and initiative. When we do that, that actually supports their development, and they're more likely to achieve what they deserve to achieve and what we want them to achieve. So I will conclude with some slides just focusing on specific strategies about being good enough, and then we can leave some time for question and answer too. Good enough parents. We're talking about good enough child, good enough family, good enough parents. We want to focus as a beacon. We do want to light the way. We want to give them a sense of who they could become. We want to believe in them more than they believe in themselves. That's different than saying you're not maximizing your potential. We want to have more faith in our children than they have in themselves, but we also want to reflect back to them an image of themselves at their finest, at their sweetest, at their best. And when we do those two things, we're a beacon, but we're also a loving, compassionate, empathic mirror. That's the support that they need to grow and to become who they're destined to become. We don't want to lose sight of the fact that there needs to be firm action, that it's often our job is to lead during adolescence, not to be liked. A lot of parents, they want to be the cool parent, the one that everybody loves, and that's great. But the reality, like I said, is that adolescence is a war zone, and there are fights that have to be fought. And that means going toe-to-toe and being skin on skin with your teenager and not being afraid to make non-negotiable decisions that will probably make them terribly unhappy. But if they're unhappy enough with us, that's what's going to promote their leaving home and not hanging around in our basement for the next 10 years. So you don't want to make it too pleasant and too cushy at home. We want to allow them to fail. We are born. We are destined to fail. That is the nature of humanity. And we're constantly protecting our children and buffering them against the experience. We don't always have to rescue them. And as I said at the very beginning, it's pain, it's discomfort, it's adversity. That's what builds us up. That's what gives us a sense of self-esteem. That's what gives us a sense of self-assuredness. You want your child to be self-competent, let them struggle through something. Because when we struggle through something and survive, when we struggle through something and we transcend, that's the most powerful source. That's the most powerful river of self-assuredness and self-worth that we're ever going to find. It's not being told by someone else that you're terrific or you're great or you're smart or you sound good. It's when we encounter something difficult and we find a way to manage and survive. And if you think about your life, the parts of your life that you're most proud of, it's probably something like that, something that was very, very difficult that you had to manage on your own. You weren't taught about it, you weren't lectured about it, you didn't read about it, you experienced it. We want to stay out of the way. We have to get out of their way for them to find their way. And they will find their way if we have supplied them with all these other resources. We do want to work in partnership. I talked about child development as this evolution. Particularly during adolescence, we want to look at how the family is built and make sure that we're giving and distributing more and more responsibility, power, autonomy to the teenager. There's an exercise I often do with families on these three dimensions. One of them is called a powergram. What decisions does your child have complete power to make? What is it that she can do entirely on her own? What are the decisions that you as parents still have complete power to make? And the third one is, where is there some shared, some overlap, some intersection of power when it comes to decision making? But the key to this little exercise, the key to the assignment is then I ask parents to look back a year ago, answer the same questions, and for the family as a whole to imagine, to envision where they'll be a year from now. Because if everything looked the same a year ago on this little chart as it looks now, or the family can't conceptualize or envision what things should look like a year from now, then evolution is not happening. Somehow development is stagnating or stymied. And so you can ask, you can literally do this assignment, or you can just kind of think about it. Is our family evolving? Am I allowing my children to evolve? Am I evolving as a mother, as a father, as an adult? You can do the same thing when it comes to responsibilities. What are this child's responsibilities? What does he have to do entirely by himself? What are we still responsible for as parents? Where is the overlap or the intersection? Where do we share responsibilities? And again, chart it through time. And particularly important during adolescence as well is on relationships. What's the teenager allowed to do completely on her own? How many dinners does she have to have with the family? Does it have to be 7 nights a week? What is it that the parents are going to be doing on their own? You know, I was working with this teenager. He was a senior. It was the beginning of senior year a few years ago. And his father said, he's a soccer player, and his father said, I have not missed any of his soccer games since he was, in youth soccer. Youth, travel, I have cut trips short, I've left work early, I've seen every single one of his games. And the father took enormous pride in this, as he should, and it was very touching. Privately, when I was talking to the son, he said, I certainly appreciate having such a supportive father. He said, the problem is that I never got to tell my father the story of a soccer game because he was always there. He says, and there were times when I wished I could tell him a story about the soccer game. Maybe not a truthful story, maybe an exaggerated story, but I never had the chance to do that. So by being so available, by being so involved, by not giving, by not creating that pocket, that sacred space of autonomy, in a way, this father was depriving his son. His son never had the experience of just playing a game without dad there in the stands or on the sideline. And being able to tell the story of your life, to create the narrative of your life, that's one of our essential jobs when we're growing up. Who am I? Who am I becoming? Who was I? What kind of person am I? So again, we want to pay attention to the evolution of the family during the adolescent years. I always say adolescence doesn't just happen to the adolescent. Adolescence happens to the entire family. Everybody grows. Everybody changes. Everybody struggles. It ushers and shepherds all of us forward to a higher state of development if we allow it to. If we stay very circumscribed, very constricted as to what growth and development are, not much growth and development occur. Like I said, we want to be increasingly comfortable disappointing our children because we don't want them to be too happy, too pleasant. I have a father, he says, when he wants to punish his son, he sends himself to his son's room because his son's room has so much cool stuff in it. So, we want all these we're going to have the cool house. We're going to have the big screen TV and the video game. So all our friends, our kids' friends come over to the house. We don't want it to be too pleasant because, sometimes then they wind up not much motivation to move forward if all our needs are being taken care of here. So we want to disappoint, and we want to be disappointed by them. And as I said, that's ultimately going back to where we started. Our job is to be left. Our job is not to keep our children enfolded within the family. Our job is to help them develop the initiative, the resources to move forward. And ultimately, transforming, not performing. Constant emphasis on performance. Adolescence is in essence a state of transformation. It's a metamorphosis. This is where the enormous strides in developmental growth take place. And unless we focus on transformation rather than performance, it stymies the possibility of that metamorphosis. This evolution that we're talking about that's so crucial doesn't quite happen. Anyone recognize this? Anyone know what this is? It's a diary, obviously, but anyone know whose diary? This is Anne Frank's diary. And we went to visit the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam, and it was really very touching because when her father discovered the diary, her father went back after the war and discovered this diary, Otto Frank was very, very close with his daughter. They were very close, father and daughter. But what he said is when he read the diary, he realized he had no idea of what was on her mind. Even though this was a caring, loving, attentive father, and they had plenty of time together, believe me, they had no choice but to have time together, what he read, he marveled at. And he was mystified by it. He had no idea. Every one of our children has some version of this inside of themselves. We think we know them. We think we understand them. You don't. It's just not possible. It's the nature of development to conceal ourselves and hide ourselves, to have something private, to have something secret. So many, many parents that I work with, the biggest problem is they underestimate. They underestimate their children because all they see is what is disappointing them, what's disillusioning them, and they don't understand what a grand and mysterious world exists within the adolescent mind. It's a remarkable thing. And if we allow that to grow, if we allow it to flourish, if we honor it and respect it, then it's more likely to develop in ways that make them deeper, more caring, more empathic, more loving human beings. Every child is preoccupied with a sense of purpose and meaning. They're not that interested in their grades. They want to avoid humiliation. They might like a boyfriend or girlfriend or a decent social life, but everybody at this age is preoccupied with a sense of purpose. Everybody needs to find meaning. And there's a question I ask almost every adolescent patient at some point. I ask them, what are the 2 most important days of your life? And they always start with this one. Oh, the day that I was born. And then they kind of, I don't know what else. And so I always give them an answer. The 2 most important days in your life are the day that you were born and the day you figured out why you were born. And there is not an adolescent in the world who doesn't take a moment and think about that. And if you haven't asked your adolescent that question, or for that matter, if you haven't asked yourself that question, it would really be a good time to do that. Because when you ask these kinds of questions, that's what animates their growth. That's what catalyzes their development. Not gorging them with academic resources and help and all the other things that we think we're doing that are working towards their development, but helping them understand that there's a reason that they're here. And when they begin to figure out that reason, even if it changes, even if it evolves, and it surely will, life starts to have purpose. Life starts to have meaning. The most demoralized and discouraged adolescents are those who have lost that sense of purpose and meaning. They've lost interest in themselves. We have everything to do with them cultivating, finding that sense of meaning. They're going to find it themselves. We're not going to find it for them. It's not findable or discoverable by anyone else. But when we create that initiative, when we focus on the importance, when we amplify and expand and augment the significance of life and help them see that it's ultimately about why you were born, that you're here, that's what helps to guide them through the complicated, treacherous narrows that are a normal part of any adolescent's life. Finally, we're talking about good enough parents, good enough children. The essence of being good enough is failing, not necessarily being good enough, not being successful. I do not want you walking out of here saying, I'm going to become now the best good enough parent that there is. I'm going to deploy all of these strategies, and damn it, my kid's going to be perfect, because that would kind of be the opposite of what I'm hoping for here. The theologian Martin Buber said, every journey has secret destinations of which the traveler is unaware. And that's life. Every journey has secret destinations of which the traveler is unaware. You can lay out your child's life as thoughtfully, as assiduously, as lovingly, as carefully as you want. Every journey has secret destinations. You have your secret destinations. Your children do too. So when you walk out of here, rather than focusing on being the absolute best good enough parent, see if you can just sit with some of the grand mystery of human relatedness, of adolescent development, and see if that begins to filter down and allow your son or daughter to inhabit that sense of humanity that they deserve to inhabit. So I think I've done enough slides for now. This would be a time if you wanted to ask any questions about what I presented or anything that was stirred or triggered by what I presented. I'd be happy to answer those questions. And we can do that for 15 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for book signing as well. Anyone want to ask anything? Oh, thank you. Thank you for being so patient at the end of a busy week when you've probably had a lot to do, and getting here may not have been easy to do. I appreciate you hanging in there with what I had to say. Anything that anyone wanted to ask or get some additional commentary on?
I can't see. Oh, I see. Go ahead.
You couldn't hear your question about 86-year-old, socializing them without criticizing them too much. I don't think it's possible to raise a child without criticizing them. I think that's kind of a misguided initiative right there. When I'm talking about appreciating them for who they are, it doesn't mean just letting them do whatever they want. It means establishing certain expectations and certain morals and certain values that matter to us. What I tend to focus on, though, like I said earlier, though, is when children are not meeting their expectations, when there's a problem. What I suggest doing is being curious about that. I made it clear to you that I would like you to sit at the dinner table for 10 minutes and not slug your sister. For some reason, every time we sit at the dinner table, you find a way to slug your sister. And A, that's not acceptable. It's not appropriate, and there will be a consequence for that. B, I want to hear more about what you're trying to do here when you slug her and what's making it so hard for you to sit there. Is 10 minutes too much of an expectation? Should we start with 5 minutes? Should we rearrange the seating so you can't slug her? Have you not yet come to terms with the fact that she's here and is going to stick around? That's the worst thing. No one consulted with me about this 6-year-old, so, I should do something about that. So the combination of setting standards and setting expectations, but also being curious when those expectations are not being met, that's where growth happens. Because ultimately, we want to attract our children's curiosity about why they do what they do, or why they don't do what they should do. And ultimately, we want them to have their own standards and their own expectations. So the combination of an expectation and criticism or a consequence in tandem with that curiosity, that inquiry about what's making it so hard, that combination usually kind of squirts kids forward. And you really got to do both. You can't just do the consequences and the criticism piece, but you also can't just do the curiosity piece. Those have to kind of work in an embraided kind of quality. When we do that, and when we attract their curiosity about why they do what they do, they start to ask themselves questions. And once children ask themselves questions, they're usually able to answer them. The problem is that a lot of what we do as parents and as schools is we don't really encourage them to ask questions. We encourage them to conform or to simply adhere to our expectations without giving it any thought. And that doesn't tend to promote growth. Other questions that anyone want to ask in the large group? Yeah.
How do you find balance between, because you talked about purpose and responsibility partly, so basically contributing to the family life.
Yeah.
But, adolescents are pushing away at the same time, and when there's conflict around that, parents think kids should still have responsibilities and contribute, and kids are pushing back on that. What are some ideas you have on managing that?
Well, specifically when it comes to adolescence, I think this set was not designed by me, by the way. I don't travel with this when I do my lecture. I'll get the wrong impression. Parenthood is basically a plane crash in the middle of the desert. The thing about adolescence is, going back to the I and the we. They want to be a part of the family, and they want to be separate. They need to have responsibilities in the home. You don't have self-respect without fulfilling responsibilities. And again, like I said, to imagine that self-esteem comes from being told that you're good at something, that's completely erroneous. It's completely false. True self-esteem, true self-respect comes from being able to handle responsibilities well, being able to manage them. And so if we deprive our children of responsibilities, we don't give them the chance to be responsible, we're essentially depriving them of self-respect. The thing about adolescents, of course, is they're also, like I said, rattling that cage and trying to get out. And that's where, ideally, you try to find a context in which they can be responsible outside of the home. That's what we want them to be doing socially. Socially, they're going to begin to look for other intimate partners besides us. They're going to be looking for romance, for eroticism, for sexuality. That's part of what adolescence is about. We want to help them funnel that sense of being responsible so that it's not just limited to the home, but also to the community at large. One of the truly difficult and heartbreaking aspects for most adolescents that I run across is they don't feel needed. They don't feel necessary. Aside from as consumers of electronics, then they're necessary because Apple would fall apart. But the sense that you're needed, that you're crucial, that's an elemental part of identity. That's a fundamental part of who we are as individuals. And so again, when we don't encourage and allow, and at times force, our young adults, our adolescents, our teens, to be responsible both in the home and beginning to be outside of the home, we essentially bleed them, we leech them of the self-respect that's necessary. So at this juncture, yes, you still have to clean your room and you still have to do your own laundry, whatever it is that those expectations are, those responsibilities. But I think it's also fair and best to promote being responsible outside of the house as well, because it's that combination again that develops a sense of fullness, a sense of wholeness, and a sense of being necessary. Like I said earlier about parents, we're never more necessary. We're never more relevant. We're never more essential than when we're raising children. And that's why it's hard for us to let go, because we don't want to be marginalized. We don't want to be peripheralized. We don't want to be shoved to the margins. Same thing is true with adolescents. They want to feel necessary. And when we're so busy coddling them or indulging them or making things easy for them or depriving them of responsibility and adversity, it's really the worst thing for their souls. And they'll never have a substantial sense of self-regard and self-worth. Yes?
So you talked about that essential question of why are you here and purpose. That's a pretty heady question. Could you describe some of your interactions and answers you get from your practice?
The question was, I guess going back to the 2 days, 2 most important days. So the question was, what are some of the responses that I've gotten? The usual response, I guess, I don't know. But I don't think that's such a bad thing, because often what I don't know means is no one asked me that question, or it didn't occur to me to ask myself that question. What I hear a lot that of course is problematic is, I don't know, I'm basically just fulfilling my parents' prerogative. I'm fulfilling their imperatives about what I should do best, and maybe I would give some thought to why I'm here. Am I only here to basically be my parents' narcissistic ambassador into the world that reflect well on them? So I get a lot of I don't knows, but I get a lot of interest and I get a lot of intrigue. And I get a lot of follow-up, maybe a session or two later or through an email where, it begins to focus a little bit perhaps on a career. I think I'm here to help people, or I think I'm here to take care of animals, or I think I'm here to participate in something, or support my grandfather as he moves towards death. There's a range of answers, but like I said a moment ago to the first question, your job is to interest them, attract their curiosity, trigger their inquisitiveness about who they are. When we do that, that's the most important part of parenting. They'll do it naturally. We're all naturally curious beings. But like I said, something about our society, something about some of our schools and school systems kind of tamps that stuff down. It kind of stuns and stymies that natural initiative and curiosity. That it makes it really very difficult for kids to grow and develop. Yeah?
Could you talk a little bit about trauma and how that impacts the development?
Yeah, the question was about trauma. I was talking about grief in the sense that everybody experiences grief, everybody experiences loss. But there are obviously, at times in children's and adolescents' lives, very concrete events that prompt grief, that prompt feelings of loss. The obvious one would be the death of someone in the family, death of a parent, death of a sibling, death of a grandparent. And then, of course, there's terrible traumas. There's tragedies that we encounter. There's violations that occur all the time. My belief, like I said, is that children really are very supple and they're very hardy. And I think sometimes we do children in general, or our concept of children, a disservice by imagining that they're brittle, by imagining that they're just not that resourceful. And adolescents in particular are very resourceful. The key to dealing with trauma is the key to dealing with any kind of loss, which is grieving. You know, how do I come to terms with what happened to me? How do I remain true to who I am despite whatever violation, whatever tragedy, whatever loss, significant as it might be, occurred? And when we respect, when we honor the nature of that loss and encourage them to grieve and build it into the general grieving that they're doing as they're moving forward, they tend to come out the other side. What we don't want to do is encourage a sense of victimization. That obviously becomes problematic and disempowers children. Pity, feeling bad for them, not encouraging them to summon their resourcefulness, their strength, their inner resilience. Those are the qualities that are built into every individual. We want to try to help them call those forth. But the trauma piece obviously has lasting scars, but people also grow from scars. And when we have traumas, it can deepen us, it can ennoble us, it can humanize us in ways that just were never anticipated. Most of us in the helping professions wound up in this field because of some trauma. That's certainly the case for me. And so if we can, what I would say is the key to maturity is you want to turn your preoccupation into your occupation. If you can make what you're preoccupied with into a living, if you can make some money doing it, that's the ultimate harbinger, the ultimate definition of maturity, or at least one of them. And so these losses, these adversities, these traumas that occur, these ought to be incorporated into the development of a more soulful, a more connected, a warmer, more hospitable human being. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about responsibility in the house and kind of giving your child, you're talking about taking introduction to your child's sense of responsibility. You're talking about, like I have a 7-year-old, you know, are you talking about like make sure they make their bed, are you talking chores, or kind of, can you give some examples of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, responsibilities for a 7-year-old basically are chores. You know, you're not expecting a 7-year-old to start adding to his college fund. You know, that's down the road. Yeah, chores. Responsibilities are things that make you feel relevant, necessary, and essential. I need you to do this. This is part of being part of this family. And the family will be better off, and you'll be better off if you do this. You're entitled to be unhappy. I'm not expecting you to be turning cartwheels. A lot of times parents get caught up in this sort of attitude. I was working with this father once. He's trying to get his son to take the trash out. And it's, you know, wouldn't do it, or he'd do it right after the trash truck left, so then he'd sit out there for 6 days. And then we worked out this kid couldn't get his nerves permanent until he started doing chores, started taking out the trash and recycling. So they come back for a session, and I said to the young man, I said, have you been doing the chores? He goes, yeah. I said, are you getting the recycling and trash out the night before? He said, yeah, I've been doing it. I said to the father, I said, is he doing it? The father goes, well, sort of. And what do you mean, sort of? Well, he's sort of doing it. I said, well, he's either doing it or he's not doing it. The trash is out, it's not out. He said, well, the father says he's doing it, but he's not very happy about it. He's grumbling. I said, well, I don't know. When I'm taking the trash out, I'm not turning cartwheels. I'm grumbling too. And so sometimes we're so busy trying to keep our children happy, or not ruffle their feathers. It doesn't promote development. So yes, you're entitled to be unhappy, but you have to bring the dishes to the sink. And should you not do it, there will be a consequence. But I'm also curious to know why you think you can partake of all that we give you in this family without contributing. I don't think that's a good long-term plan for your life. Yeah.
The search for purpose and meaning and connection. Can you talk a little bit about the role that technology is playing in this and maybe what you're seeing in practice the last 5 or so years?
Yeah. The question was about looking at this fundamental search for meaning and purpose and what role technology might play. And I think it's significant. I don't think it's as significant as some people. I mean, some people feel like, adolescents, children, they're so immersed, they're so saturated with technology that they're no longer human. I think obviously one of the problems with the immersion of technology is that sense of silence, that sense of space, that sort of sacred sanctity that all of us need to discover who we are often gets blotted out by technology because you constantly have to stay on top of social media or texting or whatever it is that you're doing. So if there's a danger, if there's a worry that I have there, it's more that we're sort of closing off that space in which true development, a true sense of self-awareness and self-knowledge takes place. On the flip side, I would say that, people said the same thing when TV came out. Once TV comes out, kids are not going to do anything, and, somehow here we are. We grew up with TVs, and we somehow figured out a way to function. So I think technology in general always creates some problems, solves some other problems. I don't tend to be as gloomy about the role of technology plays. I don't know why parents don't set limits with technology. Many times, parents will come in, he's always on his phone. Well, do you take the phone away? No. Well, I'm not sure what you want me to do here. Take the phone away. Well, he won't be able to be in touch with his friends. I think he's going to die. He'll probably be relieved, believe me, especially if it's mail, and then they get kind of caught up in stuff. They don't want to do all that stuff. So, you have to set limits and have those kind of buffers in place. But, as we all know, there's many, many children who, without social media or gaming or technology, they'd be very lonely and very isolated. It helps us to create communities, helps us develop a sense of connection. Sometimes it's phony baloney. It's not the same as being in the presence of another human being, but sometimes it's a stepping stone towards that. So, I don't tend to tear my hair out about all this stuff, although they do have to be limits. You have a question?
Yeah, I have a single parent question. When you talk about having a child be, feel relevant, necessary, and essential, what about the situation where it's probably too far in that direction to just have a single mom with an almost 15-year-old boy, for example, and, just the two of you at every meal?
Yeah.
It's too much.
Every family situation has its challenges when it comes to finding that middle ground. So you're right, in a family where there's, two parents and the parents can evenly distribute responsibility, the tendency might be to not ask enough of the child. In a one-on-one situation, the tendency would be, I really need you to do stuff, we're not going to get through without that. I tend to think that if we're going to err in one direction or another, and everybody errs in one direction or another, it's better to err in the direction of too much responsibility than too little. It's the children who grow without a sense of responsibility that wind up not being able to function well as contributing members to society. But again, one of the advantages of adolescence, and there's many disadvantages, as I said, but one of the advantages is they're much more sophisticated in their thinking. So these can all be conversations. Like that exercise I gave you, the powergram or the relationship gram. Let's talk together, as mother and son in this case, about your feelings about how responsibility is shared. Do you feel that it's equitable right now? Does it feel different than it did a year ago? What do you envision it being like a year from now? What do you think I'm going to do when you leave home? Because I anticipate you're going to leave home at some point. So engaging them in these conversations often puts you in the same side of the fence so that you can sort it out. And as I said, we often underestimate adolescents. We minimize the extent to which they're giving tremendous thought, tremendous depth. Like Anne Frank's father, he thought he knew her, and then he read this diary, and he realized there's an entire world that she was living that he had the faintest clue about. Every one of your kids is like that. And we want to try to tease and draw that stuff to the surface as much as we can. When we do that, we tend to have a better relationship with them. More importantly, they have a better relationship with themselves. Are we running out of Q&A time?
I just want to be respectful of everybody's time, and I believe Dr. Sachs has some books to sign up in the lobby. So thank you, Dr. Sachs, so much for taking